Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. Life is too short to eat boring granola. Granarly, the world's one and only whiskey granola, fills that void. When I was a student at the University of Texas, I worked with Granarly, a granola company based in Austin, falling in love with both the granola and the mission. Go to granarly.com with code WRTP15 to get 15% off to fuel your next adventure. See show notes for more details. Today, we have Clay Jordan with us, the superintendent of both Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. These two parks, located side by side in Central California in the southern Sierra Nevada, highlight the grandeur of nature and contain diversity such as the world's largest trees, grand mountains, deep canyons, and even the highest point in the lower 48 states. Clay has been the superintendent at Sequoia and Kings Canyon since 2020, previously serving as Deputy Superintendent at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Today, we have the privilege of hearing Clay's story, learning from his diverse experiences across both national parks and seashores, and getting a glimpse into his heart and passion for our national parks. Clay, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Maddie. I'm really happy to spend some time with you.
Yeah. Well, first, I guess as we jump into things, kind of a fun way to start things off is just talking about some of the more unique situations that you've experienced while working at the National Park Service. And then we can kind of dive into, what led you to where you are, your progression within the Park Service, but kind of giving everybody a little taste of these are some of the more unique things that you've seen in your time so far.
Yeah, I'll give you one example that's perhaps the most unique. It's not something you would think in terms of a park ranger or a park manager that you'd have a role like this, but back in 2010, if you recall, we kind of had this national emergency at the time with this tragic accident of the Deepwater Horizon, this when the BP oil well had suffered a catastrophic accident and spilled a lot of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And if you recall, that oil spill threatened much of the Gulf Coast, including units of Gulf Islands National Seashore, where I served as chief ranger at the time.
Yeah.
Now, from a federal government oversight, the response for the oil spill fell to the Department of Homeland Security, where the Coast Guard lies, and the Department of the Interior that manages the marine resources, the birds, numerous coastal federal lands like wildlife refuges and national parks like Gulf Islands National Seashore. And so the oil spill response was divided into three major zones. In Gulf Islands National Seashore, which was my home at the time, lay in the northern Gulf zone, along with the coasts of Mississippi, Alabama, and the Florida Panhandle, and then the waters going out 50 miles. And so Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, decided to assign the Park Service Director at the time, John Jarvis, as a senior administration official for the Northern Gulf Zone. So working closely with, as an incident commander with the Coast Guard and with BP and with incident commanders from each of the states. And as fate would have it, being in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, I was assigned to go to Mobile, Alabama, and serve directly as Director Jarvis's deputy. And so here I went from just being a chief ranger in a medium-sized national seashore to all of a sudden in a role of briefing governors and cabinet members and helping direct an incident response that was comprised of 25,000 people and 5,000 vessels. And it was the ultimate collaborative effort of government, private industry, all kind of focused on national scale emergency.
Yeah.
But certainly something unique for a park ranger, to find themselves doing one day.
So I grew up in Austin, and so I remember that. I mean, I guess the whole country was very aware of it. One, I'm like, I can't believe that was in 2010. Like, that's a long time ago. So that's my first response. And I think I was like a freshman in high school or something. So I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, so I just feel aged by that. But then also, it's cool to, like you said, see those moments where the different sectors and the private sector and with the government, different government agencies partnering and kind of like creating a task force. And I know we'll talk about this later on in our conversation, but I know a very probably real thing with being the superintendent at Sequoia and Kings Canyon is some of the wildfires that you've dealt with, some of the droughts. And then I actually had read, I think you were at the Smoky Mountains when there was that really big one in 2016.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so you've had, it looks like a couple other incidents where it's just like these emergency task forces are needed to respond, and kind of these unique groups that don't usually partner together have to, figure out how to like deal with something that crosses all these like pre-described boundaries of this is national forest land, this is park service land, this is public land. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It takes a lot of moving parts and a lot of people working together, whether it is to manage a national park on a daily basis or at a time of a great emergency. And of course, you have a lot of people rallying together to work together to address whatever the problem is. And yes, I've had a few experiences along those lines, and each one I've tried to apply some lessons to for the next one.
With when you all were responding to the oil spill, was the main tactic trying to clean up as much oil from the ocean, or was it, more so protecting the wildlife? I don't know the nitty gritty of kind of how one even responds to that.
Yeah, so the oil spill response is kind of broken down into two major parts. Number one was kind of focused on the wellhead, on trying to cap the well, which was a drama that was a huge engineering feat and played out over the span of several months. And then to also try to mitigate some of the impacts of the oil at the wellhead by applying some dispersants as the oil was leaking into the Gulf. The part of the spill response that I was connected to was trying to mitigate to protect the coastlines from the advance of the oil. So we put out hundreds of miles of booms across marshes and estuaries. We also responded to birds that were soaked in oil and brought them to rescue centers that we set up, marine mammals. And then as the oil hit the beaches, then having thousands of people out on the beaches cleaning up the oil that had hit the beach. So it was a massive effort of resources, and it was applying, as I said, tens of thousands of people were focused on this effort.
Again, this is me skipping ahead a little bit, but in preparation for the interview, I think it was with the Sequoia Parks Conservancy, perhaps? Yes, the Sequoia Parks Conservancy. There was one of the interview questions. You had, for context, been on this panel, and one of the interview questions, or maybe it was for the people in the audience, but it was like, who would be interested in volunteering at a national park, or, if given the opportunity? I think it was like 93% of people said yes, or something like that, and then the other percent said maybe. No one said no. So it's cool to see these moments where, like you're saying with the oil spill, of just people stepping up and being willing to. I'm sure it's not like an insignificant task to be cleaning the oil or trying to protect the coastline from that. So it's cool to see that in the different pockets of the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. Volunteerism is a huge thing within. Now, the oil spill response there was a big price tag to pay, and BP Oil was on the hook for footing that bill, and they met that responsibility. But volunteerism in a broader sense is huge. People have a connection to national parks because it's in the national parks that we preserve and tell the stories of our nation's natural and cultural heritage.
Yeah.
And so people connect to some aspect of that heritage. And it is a way for folks to engage, share their talents with other people. And so we would be in a world of hurt as a national park system and as a national park system if we didn't have so many people willing to work with us and to provide their talents and services in such a broad spectrum of ways.
That's cool. Well, jumping back, I know we've talked a little bit about, the work at the oil spill, and then also obviously mentioned that, you're here today because you're currently the superintendent of two of our great parks. But I'd love to hear a little bit about your time growing up. What was your experience as a kid in nature, and kind of where did this interest in being a person actively pursuing our resources come from?
That's a really good question, Maddie, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that because it goes way back. So I've been drawn to nature from the youngest age that I could ever remember. And I was born and raised in suburban Long Island.
Nice.
And so nature meant a local wooded lot near my house, maybe venturing a little further, a marsh along the Long Island Sound. And school field trips to a nature preserve just resonated really well with me and were memorable. Seeing a raccoon was exciting as a teen. Seeing probably my first deer wasn't until I was a teenager. But I'd never been to a national park, or at least a park unit that I identified as a national park. In reality, I've been to places like the Statue of Liberty, Fire Island National Seashore, Saratoga National Battlefield. But as a kid, I didn't realize that those were units of the national park system, just like a Yellowstone or a Great Smoky Mountains. But they're as important to preserving the nation's heritage as any national park. Very early age, I don't know exactly what it is, but I set my sights from age 10 on the road to being a park ranger.
Wow. Without even having been, I guess at that point, to a national park.
I had never met a park ranger until I became a pseudo ranger. I was an intern in college working at Mount Rainier National Park. But at 10 years old, I wanted to become a ranger. And so I remember pulling out the Rand McNally. I was, like I said, a very goal-oriented kid at the time. And I pulled out the old Rand McNally atlas, and I would look at what national parks were closest to where I lived. And I focused in on Shenandoah National Park. And I wrote a letter. And I said, would you please send me information about the park and how you become a park ranger? And I did the same thing to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and then Acadia and Everglades. And to this day, I remember the excitement of every day running to the mailbox to look for a return to my letter, and then getting this classic government plain brown oversized envelope that would have brochures in it. And it would have always contain a park brochure map, very similar to the ones we use today. And I would spend hours, like at Shenandoah, the map of Shenandoah, looking at one of those icons for a ranger station, fantasizing about, living in the ranger station and driving jeeps and chasing poachers and fighting forest fires. And so I set my goals for that and went to college for park administration and outdoor recreation, joined the fire department to start building my emergency services portfolios. I guess I was something of an action junkie, became an EMT. And years after receiving that brochure, that first brochure from Shenandoah, I found myself living at one of those ranger station icons. And I did drive jeeps, I did chase poachers, and I did fight forest fires.
Oh my gosh.
Of course, as is usually the case, reality wasn't quite as cool as the fantasy.
It was not an Indiana Jones movie.
It was not an Indiana Jones movie. The Jeep that I drove was, a whole lot less interesting than the one that played out of my head as a younger kid. But it was kind of really a dream fulfilled, and I guess it clicked, and I've been on that track ever since.
I guess I'm curious how you knew, like how you even found out about a park ranger. Do you remember kind of how you found out about that being something one could do to then start this letter writing journey?
I remember that there was a show on TV probably back in the late 60s or something, and it was based in the Australia outback. I don't remember the name of the program, but it was about this park ranger. And his family lived in a remote ranger station, and his wife dispatched for him on the park radio, and he drove a really cool looking Land Rover type Jeep.
Nice.
And he chased poachers and fought fires. And the only difference is he also had kangaroos running around, and I haven't had the kangaroo experience in my life. But I think that's the closest connection. He was a ranger. And I say, I think we have such a thing in this country. And I guess from there, I hit the Rand McNally, and the rest is a story told.
Yeah, it's endearing because I guess for folks who are listening who don't know the way, and for you, I think the way that I have started this podcast and I'm reaching out to superintendents is through letter writing. And so it's just, I feel that same excitement of kind of like waiting for responses and, just throwing a letter in the mail and being like, well, I hope they get it. I mean, I haven't truly sent a letter in the mail in a long time, but yeah, so it's sweet to hear that is how you kind of initially reached out to some of the parks, and cool that, because you had mentioned Great Smoky Mountains and Shenandoah and how you ended up working at both of those places later in your career. So it's sweet to remember specifically desiring to work at those places.
Absolutely. Yeah, pretty exciting.
So I'm assuming, and a fun fact, I forgot, or not even a fun fact, but I currently live in New York City. And so it's fun to hear you talking about the the raccoons I was laughing because last night I think I saw on my street walking back to my apartment, I think I counted 8 rats. It was funny counting the rats. And I was like, well, this is wildlife in its own sense.
I suppose it is, the pigeons and whatnot, but and some people don't put raccoons in a whole lot better category.
That's what made me think of them.
Neighborhood pests.
Yeah.
That's right. But I sure loved them as a kid, and I still think they're pretty cool animals.
Yeah, they're not bad. I like them better than rats and pigeons, I will say. If I had to rank them. So I know you had said that you went to study park administration at UMass. It sounds like you were pretty set on when going to college looking for a program that kind of supported that journey to being a park ranger.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and while I was still in college, I learned of a program called the Student Conservation Association.
Oh, cool.
That provided internship opportunities in national parks and national forests, and they are still very active and a very important partner of the National Park Service today. And so I started at Mount Rainier as a SCA interpretive ranger doing education programs for the public.
Okay.
And then I switched over, as I said, I was something of an action junkie and became a protection ranger, doing emergency services such as search and rescue, EMS, structural and wildland firefighting, working in campgrounds and entrance stations, a lot of different things that you do as that kind of ranger. And then eventually I went to the Law Enforcement Academy, was certified as a federal law enforcement officer, doing patrols and investigations. And so I cut my teeth doing these functions while working seasonal jobs at Mount Rainier, Fire Island National Seashore in New York, Cape Cod National Seashore in Massachusetts, Olympic National Park out in Washington State, and Shenandoah National Park, as we've talked about down in Virginia. And after college, I moved into the permanent ranks, beginning as an area ranger at Fire Island National Seashore. Though I got my start far from home, all the way across the country at Mount Rainier. I got my first permanent job back close to my own neighborhood, back near Long Island. Did that for a while and then transferred to Shenandoah.
So all the different seasonal places that you mentioned, I think you said Olympic and Mount Rainier and Cape Cod and all that, was that all during college, like doing internships, I guess, or?
No, after that first year as an internship, then I got hired as a seasonal
Okay.
ranger.
Okay.
And so the National Park Service hires still thousands and thousands of seasonal employees.
Right.
And they're a lot of your front lines.
Okay.
And so I did those things as a seasonal ranger through my college summers. And then
Okay.
after college, it was very hard to get that permanent, that first year-round permanent job. And so I continued to do it for a couple of years after college before my ship came in and landed that permanent job at Fire Island.
I had talked to recently David Smith, who's the superintendent of the Golden Gate National Parks, and he,
Yes.
I believe, because I've heard it's pretty hard to get that transition, or what I've learned is getting that transition to permanent can be quite difficult. And I think he ended up working in Border Patrol for like 2 years, because then he was a permanent government employee, and then transferring back into the Park Service was a little bit easier. So it's interesting to see the different ways that people have kind of made that transition from seasonal working to like a more permanent position within one of the different Park Service locations.
Yeah, and if you have a little gray hair like me and David, back in those days, it was harder to get in.
Yeah.
There are more opportunities for getting in nowadays, and so
cool.
it doesn't take this Herculean effort, to land that permanent job. So it is a whole lot more encouraging for young people who
That's
have
cool.
an interest to go into this field. I think early in my career, it was kind of like what some people might advise if you want to go into acting.
Right.
If anything can discourage you from doing it, you probably ought to let it.
Yeah.
Because it was really hard to get there. But with determination, there's always a road forward. And but fortunately today there are more avenues to get in,
That's cool.
and it's a good time for folks to get into the National Park Service and other land management agencies.
Through all the different, before we jump into your permanent position at Fire Island, when you were working as a seasonal worker at the different locations, were you acting as, were you using your EMT and firefighting training pretty regularly?
Yes, very much so, and it kind of depended on the park that I was at.
Right.
So some parks have more law enforcement activity, other parks have more fire activity.
Right.
And so the balance between those things varies quite a bit from park to park. But yes, I was trained in all those functions.
Yeah.
and applied them. Some of places like your national seashores don't have too many structural firefighters because
Right.
you can tap into local departments and that sort of thing. But yeah, I kind of cut my teeth in learning those skills in all those areas. That's one of the challenges of being a park ranger, a protection park ranger, is that you're applying those same skills as a city law enforcement officer, as a city firefighter, as somebody doing the search and rescue, and that's a lot of different skill sets to maintain. And even though each of those things you're kind of doing part-time typically, as you're doing a mix of things, when things happen, the exact same expectations are on you to be as proficient a law enforcement officer or be as proficient a firefighter or an EMT as those paramedics that may be doing it every single day in the city. So it is challenging to wear so many different hats and to be proficient, but it's also one of the unique aspects of this line of work.
Yeah, you have to be able to pretty quickly tap into the full depth of each skill set without the repetitiveness of kind of getting in a groove of each of them. So I can imagine the ability to shapeshift a little bit.
Yeah, that's really well put, because you're being on patrol, kind of doing law enforcement, and at any moment you might switch into a totally different gear, and then be heading off to rappel down a cliff or to respond to a fire, and then be putting away your gear, and then a law enforcement call comes.
Yeah.
And so it is, it's certainly, adventurous, but you can also choose your level. You can, there's so much diversity and variety in the national parks. If you really want to focus more on the law enforcement, there are parks you can go to and they do more than that.
Yeah.
Or other parks if you want to do scuba diving and that sort of thing. The opportunities are there. And of course, I really want to emphasize that we're just talking about one kind of ranger too, a protection ranger.
Right.
We also have rangers that focus on education, and they're doing curriculum-based education with school systems. They are providing professional programs for visitors coming to the parks. We have ologists, biologists, botanists, archaeologists, the whole realm of scientists that do resource management, and they are park rangers too. And so then, of course, we've got all the folks who maintain facilities. And so there is an enormous range of opportunities, and park rangers can really mean a lot of different things in national parks.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually didn't know that was such a broad, of course, in my experience at national parks, have interacted with different park rangers and stuff, but I didn't know that it could be such a broad category of different, I guess, specializations in a sense. I'm curious, so when you transitioned to Fire Island, which I do think it's funny that you kind of went to these places very far away and then get to be closer to home. Again, I've talked to, so far, a couple different superintendents of different parks, but I'm curious about what working at a national seashore is like and how that, I'm sure, again, it depends based on the location, but what was your role, what was your permanent role at Fire Island?
Yeah, so I was a area ranger, so it was still doing those same type of duties, but now in a beach environment, doing boat patrol.
Interesting.
I didn't do any boat patrol at Mount Rainier.
Yeah.
But at Fire Island, so the toys are a little bit different. The vehicles that you use, but it was very similar duties. As I started moving through the ranks there at Fire Island and at Shenandoah, then I started getting into the supervisory ranks and started gaining some other experiences. Running entrance stations and campgrounds and just a variety of other things that started to come into play.
Yeah, because then you transitioned, after Fire Island, you said you transitioned to Shenandoah.
Yeah.
And what was it like, I guess, going to the park that you had set your eyes on so young and kind of being like, okay, I did it. This is what I've been working for.
It was really quite surreal. Of course, by this time, a lot of things that happened, to get to that point.
Right.
But I would, pinch myself and say, okay, enjoy this. Enjoy this moment. And because there were also a lot of stressful aspects of the job,
Right.
I didn't anticipate the stress, when I was 10 years
Of
old,
course.
chasing a poacher seemed like a lot of fun, and it can be rewarding, but there's also a lot of stressful and tragic things that obviously that you get involved with. But I always try to remember those times and remember how much it thrilled me to then meet a park ranger, once I started working in parks, and to remember that for when somebody comes running up to me, especially somebody young, and asking me a question, I try to picture myself in that person as I was, to try to never try to lose that important integration, because you never know who you're influencing for the next generation.
Yeah, and what dreams you're helping to grow and inspire, and not being, that's something I think that's cool to think about, of just how can you kind of live your life in a way that you're not, and again, if people have dreams, they're going to go after them and whatever it takes, but I think just being a person that can encourage people's dreams and fuel the fire that they're already running off of.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It's wild. It's been a really neat journey for sure.
And then after Shenandoah, is that when you transitioned to the Great Smoky Mountains?
Yeah. Well, there was Gulf Islands in between, so I worked my way up through the ranks up at Shenandoah National Park. I was there 18 years.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
Met my wife there. We started raising a family there.
That's
they
just a pause on that. That's like, it's cool that, again, like Shenandoah is where you're like, this is the park I want to go to. And then it's like the park where you spend 18 years, it's just a cool, I don't know if coincidence is the right word, but that's where you ended up meeting your wife and having your family. And I don't know, there's something very
Yeah, and
cool
it's the
about
park
that.
that I've been at the longest in my career. 18 years in one place is a long time in
It
the
is.
National Park Service in a career. And that's where I gained more and more experiences. I ended up as the Deputy Chief Ranger, at headquarters there. And that grew me for moving on as a Chief Ranger at Gulf Islands National Seashore. Which is the most visited national seashore in the system.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Fun to know. As a little Texas, well, is it in Texas? Part of it? Or no?
So it spans the northern coast. There's about a dozen units, barrier beaches, some that you drive to, some you take a ferry boat to,
Right.
some that are on the mainland, and they're stretched over about 150 miles of the northern Gulf from the Biloxi, Mississippi area over to the Florida Panhandle, to the Destin, Florida area. So it's very scattered, and but incredible resources. You have so much of the history, coastal fortifications in many of these places, going through several centuries, and then the fauna and the flora there is just spectacular.
Were you, I'm sure, kind of dealing with hurricanes in that area was a pretty real part of your role at specifically the Gulf Island seashore?
Yeah. The one thing is when you're working at a park that is stretched across 150 miles of the Gulf of Mexico, that is an awfully big target.
Yeah.
So it seemed like just about every tropical storm that entered the Gulf was going to threaten or potentially threaten some part of the seashore. And so, I spent a lot of time in battening the hatches and preparing for storms, and then starting recovery efforts after the storms. I was there about 4 years, and we did not have any major hurricanes. We were between major hurricanes at that time. Of course, we did have an oil spill. Yeah. So I can't say that I made it through unscathed in my time in the Gulf.
Yeah, you got, I guess, some luck in some areas, not across the board. But what was it like transitioning from being Deputy Chief Ranger to Chief Ranger at the seashore?
Yeah. So, of course, you're changing from a national park to a national seashore, so you have some differences there. But of course, at that point, my seasonal days, I had already worked at Cape Cod National Seashore. I worked at Fire Island National Seashore. And for much of my career, in fact, that was something of a pattern. I've always loved the beach. And so I've worked at several traditional mountain parks, and I've worked at several national seashores, and they've alternated back and forth for much of my career. So when I'm in the mountains, I would miss the beach. When I'm at the beach, I would miss the mountains. And so it was just one of those things that would play out.
Yeah.
And then moving, I went from being a deputy chief ranger at Shenandoah to being the chief ranger at Gulf Islands, and that basically meant that I had more administrative. I'd earned the privilege, I suppose, of spending more time in the computer, more time in meetings, and at that point starting to live vicariously through the rangers that I worked with, but less
funny how
time
it goes.
It happens to work that way. You have to find your satisfactions in different ways.
Yes, exactly. And then, so you spent the 4 years there. That's, again, where you dealt with the oil spill. And then, I guess, did the flip-flop and went back to the mountains be at Great Smoky Mountains. And you were there for a good amount of time, I believe, right?
Yeah, about a decade. So once the well was capped, I found my way headed to Great Smoky Mountains. I started there as the chief ranger for a few years, and then got promoted into the job of deputy superintendent of the park, which was the next level up. But yeah, I was there a good solid decade.
And I know that Shenandoah and Great Smoky Mountains are pretty close to each other. How would you say just the way people interact with those two parks and, the flora and the fauna, do you feel like they differ a ton, or do you feel like there's similarities between the two parks?
A lot of similarities. I used to describe working at the Smokies as Shenandoah on steroids.
Okay.
A lot of similarities. It was just a matter of volume.
Right.
Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the most visited national park that has the national park in the label.
Right.
And so it was considerably busier, a longer season. The mountains were maybe a little bit bigger, a little bit more water. So some of the scale of things was a little bit larger, but otherwise very similar issues, a lot of some similar type challenges, and both places just extremely rewarding in their own rights.
We had mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that in 2016 there was a pretty big fire in the Smoky Mountains. Was that, I actually don't know, I know, not living in California, I hear that wildfires are unfortunately a lot more common in that part of the U.S., but was it pretty unexpected in the Smoky Mountains, or?
Yeah, I think it was a time of some very high drought, and so what we experienced in the Great Smoky Mountains was fire behavior that would have been impressive by Southern California standards. And unfortunately, it demonstrated that you can have catastrophic fires in all parts of the country, and certainly in the Southern Appalachia. And that was a very tragic situation. Very difficult for everybody to go through, whether working for the Park Service, the communities. It was a very difficult time, and loss of life and loss of homes. Very, very difficult, tragic situation.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, it's it's weird when stuff you think doesn't happen in your area kind of infiltrates and then, creates just devastation, honestly. What was it like in the aftermath of that, of kind of the just experience of the volunteers at the park and the workers there?
Yeah, I think it was a situation where the community really rallied. It was very traumatized community, park employees. We had some park employees who lost homes, of course, many people from the communities. It was such a difficult time, but also a time where people rallied and came together to get a community back on its feet, and it has made a great economic recovery. But it is a community that is still healing, and lives were changed, and some will never return back to what they were. So like any difficult time in any part of the country, it is a story of resilience and of healing.
Yeah.
And it's an area that will just continue on that healing track. But it is, people are coming in large numbers and remembering, and enjoying the magic that is associated with the area.
Yeah, I was just in the Great Smoky Mountains for the first time a couple weeks ago, actually. And it was really, I mean, I can't say I've been anywhere like it. And just the way that it has that smokiness and it's hard to picture and imagine, but it's pretty surreal when you're there, and then having the sunset and just beautiful atmosphere that creates. And then being also, for me, it was weird to see black bears not in Colorado or white. That to me was new. I would say, I was I wouldn't think that bears live not in the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada and stuff like that, but they do.
They sure do. In fact, in very large numbers throughout the East. Shenandoah, the Smokies, go all the way up to New England, Pennsylvania. Yep, in very, very high numbers. But the Smokies is a great place to to experience black bears.
Yeah, I got to see a little bit of it, which was cool.
Yeah.
Transitioning into your current position at Sequoia and Kings Canyon, was that a transition you were actively seeking out or an opportunity that arose?
Yeah. So I had always had this love for the Sequoia Kings Canyon since my wife and I had traveled here for the first time back in the 1990s. So I was a tourist.
Yeah.
And we come out west for a couple of weeks every summer. And as the kids grew, we went on family vacations here and had the same experiences that we have visitors that they have all the time here. And so about 3 years ago, when the job opened up, I saw an opportunity. At this point, we had been at the Smokies for about a decade.
Yeah.
And it was an opportunity to join a team of protecting, a place that we valued so much. And it was an opportunity for my wife, who was born and raised in the San Diego area, to be able to return and spend time with her family. So I threw my name in the hat, and the powers that be decided that I would be a good fit for the position.
Cool. What, because you've been, I guess you'll be coming up on 3 years in November. What have been some unexpected things coming to Sequoia and Kings Canyon?
Yeah, I think that I would have to say climate change. It really comes to mind. So if you think about climate change, this is something we've been talking about for such a long time. And to me, it's always felt like a theoretical risk, something that is going to happen at some point in the future. And those impacts would happen very slowly over time.
Right.
I think what has been so surprising to me and disconcerting is the pace in which these impacts are occurring, and the challenges imposed on many managers of parks, refuges, forests to try to mitigate those impacts. And in my short time here at Sequoia Kings Canyon, we have experienced the two worst natural disasters in the history of the parks. And these parks were established in 1890, and just a year apart, we experienced the two worst impacting natural disasters. And from a climate change perspective, what's incredible is that they both were from the extreme opposite ends of the spectrum. So we had exceptional drought and catastrophic wildfire on one end.
Right.
And then just a year later, record snowpack, which caused extreme flooding damage from a series of atmospheric rivers, both of them causing a lot of damage, and all within about a year's time. So that really has created some unprecedented challenges for us, both in terms of short-term recovery, such as repairing damaged infrastructure, to the long-term efforts, such as replanting a grove of the sequoias, and just being able to restore those visitor services.
I can see the disconcerting nature of it. Never would be probably you're not one, I can deal with one, but not the other. But to have the two ends of the spectrum, you're like, oh, that doesn't feel great.
Yeah, very surprising, but it's also where there's challenge, there's opportunities.
Right.
And it has been rewarding to work with a lot of talented people in different walks of life that are try to work together on these issues.
Right. Do you think coming in and having, like you said, two of the worst natural disasters the park's history has seen, do you think that, or is that what led to you being pretty involved with the Sequoia Parks Conservancy, or was that something already in the works?
Yeah, so what's kind of interesting when you kind of take a look at some of the focus of my attention, if you go back to the fall of 2020, and when I interviewed for the job, like most people, when they're preparing for a job interview, you do your homework. And so in my case, it's like, okay, what are the issues going on at Sequoia Kings Canyon? You prepare for a panel interview so that you can have a discussion about those issues and what you might bring to the table in trying to resolve those issues. And I did just that. in September of 2020. But there was one issue that was not even on my radar, nor did it even come up during the interview. Yet before I would get the job and the moving truck would actually arrive weeks later to move us out to California, one issue arose to such great importance that it would end up dominating my tenure here at Sequoia Kings Canyon. And that is the issue of giant sequoia conservation.
Right.
Huge.
In what way was it, I guess, brought to your awareness?
Yeah, so, first of all, to set the stage, giant sequoias are the largest trees in the world, as you said in your introduction. They're found only in the Sierra Nevada, and about 40% of them are found in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park. And then we have crazy. 7 of the 10 largest the largest trees in the world are preserved in these two parks. And so they're a big deal here.
To say it lightly.
To say it lightly, if you're going to come to Sequoia and Kings Canyon, you should be interested in giant sequoias. And besides being the largest, they're also among the oldest living beings. And they can live to be over 3,000 years.
No, they're not.
Are the oldest ones. Yes. I mean, we are talking about older than ancient Rome. We are talking about the trees that you
3,000 years?
3,000 years.
I did not see that while preparing, or I skipped over that. I feel like I would have remembered that.
And think about that. You come to this park, and I'll take you to some trees that were around before Julius Caesar and have been standing in the spots that they've been standing for that long. And it is something of a spiritual experience just about to be in their presence.
I think you did say at one point you were like, yeah, they've been around for hundreds of generations. And I was like, oh, maybe he meant like 100 years. But like, wow.
They have,
oh my gosh.
They've gotten that way, Maddie, because they have proven themselves nearly impervious to those things that usually kill trees, fire, insects, and disease. And in fact, sequoias are dependent upon low and moderate intensity fire to propagate and to exist. And so while I was interviewing for the position back in September 2020, the Castle Fire was this large, huge fire that spread, and it burned into Sequoia National Park from the neighboring national forest.
Okay.
And the combination of heavy accumulations of fuels and extreme drought conditions caused the fire to inflict enormous destruction in its path. And the fire burned through a number of giant sequoia groves, causing death to large numbers of large giant sequoias that had stood on the landscape for thousands of years.
Wow.
And death of a large number of sequoias at once was never been experienced before. I mean, you could go back, if you want to look for when we've lost a large number of giant sequoias to fire, we can track it because these trees maintain logs through the tree rings. And biologists can drill a core into the tree, pull out a thin core, and can study the tree rings. And you can see things like droughts, and you can see when they've been exposed to fire. And so we know what they have survived through over the lifetime of these trees, which again, it spans up to 3,000 years or more.
Oh my gosh.
And so we know back in the Middle Ages, in the year 1297 to be exact, there was a bad drought. And in that year, there was a fire that came through and actually killed about a dozen giant sequoias.
How do you know, or how are they able to determine which trees were killed?
Well, that's an interesting question. So picture a grove, right? A cluster of trees together that are really old. And you do some core samples, and you can see that through these trees that they went through drought and they went through a fire in 1297.
Right.
Now, of course, all the trees that you're looking at, that you're pulling the cores, are survived the
Right.
fire, obviously, because they're still standing. But in a section of this grove, there is not a single tree older than 1297 that is younger than the fire. And so by knowing the size of that area, that all of a sudden you have these trees that are younger than 1297, right?
Right.
Born after 1297. And we can plot out how much space that is. And then through models, we can say, hey, there would have been about a dozen trees here that these younger trees replaced.
Right.
So something happened to these trees around 1297. And so we can surmise that these trees were lost in this fire in 1297.
Wow.
Now, after that, if you want to find another episode where there's a large number of trees that were killed, you fast forward to 1988, some 700 years later, there was a forest fire that killed a similar number of trees, but under very extraordinary circumstances. It was in a timbered area, there was a lot of slash and very unnatural conditions, and it killed about a dozen trees. But then you move ahead about another 25 years or so, and after several years of bad drought here in the Sierra Nevada, there was a fire that killed about 100 large sequoias, all in one fire. But maybe this is a one-off. This was a red flag. This is a concern. But 2 years later, there were then two fires as the drought continued. Two fires burned in 2017. Collectively, they killed about another 100 trees.
Oh my gosh.
So these incidents were troubling, but statistically pretty minor.
Right.
Until 2020, when I was interviewing for the job, the Castle Fire burned into the park, burned through a series of groves, and killed up to around, now, ready for this? 10,000 large giant sequoias in one fire.
So sad.
Somewhere between 7 and 10,000 large giant sequoias were killed in one fire. Totally unprecedented. And so this fire was burning while I interviewed. And when I got the job, the interim superintendent had arranged a briefing as some of the early information was coming from the scientists out in the field as far as the effects of the fire. And so she arranged a briefing for the incoming superintendent, and then for the previous superintendent, who is now the deputy regional director, whose name is Woody Smeck. And the briefing was provided by the Science and Resource Management Chief here at the park, Dr. Christy Brigham. And she taught us about, the distressing information that was still rolling in from the field as the fire was burning. And it was just a really tough time. At the end of that briefing, Woody Smeck made the observation that, boy, it feels like a call to action was needed to address this new emerging threat to this iconic species. So as I drove across the country, I covered hundreds of miles of open highways. Some of those open areas, there's not a whole lot to see beyond the hood ornaments. And
I mean, I've driven through West Texas many a times, and it can be bleak.
At least along the highway corridor,
right?
Right. And so driving cross country, I spent a lot of time on hands-free, talking to staff out here, saying, what would a call to action look like if we were to do something like this? And so by the time I had gotten to Three Rivers, the headquarters for Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, the concept of a coalition, which we call the Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition, was launched. And so we have built a coalition to stop the losses of giant sequoias to fire, to insects, to whatever threats that they face, because it didn't just stop with that one fire.
Right.
The next year, in my tenure, a year later, we had another two catastrophic fires, one in Sequoia Kings Canyon called the KMP Complex, and another one called the Windy Fire, and they killed, again, a good number of trees. So in three fires in 2 consecutive years, we've lost nearly 1/5 of the entire giant sequoia population. And so the Giant Sequoia Coalition is now up to speed, and it is comprised of all of the land managers that manage public and tribal giant sequoia groves. So there are 11 federal, tribal, state, and local land managers that are all working together, and we are supported by numerous academic institutions, other federal and state agencies, conservation organizations, all focused on trying to mitigate these emerging threats to sequoias. And as we've gotten the word out about what has been happening to these trees that people value so much, we've seen great support from the administrations at both the federal and the state levels, as well as Congress, a lot of philanthropic support coming in through partners like the Sequoia Parks Conservancy, the Save the Redwoods League, just a lot of partners working together. And as distressing as it was just a couple of years ago, I will say that at this point, I am guardedly optimistic about the future of sequoias, because we have far exceeded my expectations in working together to find strategies and to implement strategies to protect the remaining sequoias. We have a lot of work left to be done, but we have taken some giant steps in the right direction with so much public support. And so that has been daunting, and it has been challenging, and making the progress has been rewarding, because it feels like we're working together across the Sierra Nevada range.
Yeah, and it's, a privilege in a sense to then I was talking to Sue. She's the superintendent at Capitol Reef. I don't know if you've worked with her before, but in her tenure in the Park Service, one of her positions was replanting redwoods or some sequoia trees. And it's just cool to get more context of the history of the trees. And I think you sharing even that history of the trees of look, we know we lost 12. 12 trees versus 10,000 trees, just regardless if you're a statistics wizard, it's shocking. And so what a privilege to be so intentionally stewarding this protection of these. I'm like, shoot, I got to get out to Sequoia and just have that experience being around these trees that have been around pretty much longer than most things we as humans can, aside from mountains themselves and the ocean, that we can kind of experience and be around.
Yeah.
So that's cool, and it warms my heart to hear kind of your passion and interest in preserving that species.
Well, and just by the way, of course, this didn't just start, right? With these fires and in my time here, we've had ologists that have had some warning and some concern that something like this could happen.
Right.
And so there's been a lot of folks that were already focused on the conservation of sequoias and the effects of climate change and making forests more resilient out west. And I think that the giant sequoias would just amplify the attention and the focus on it. And it is something of an icon to climate change.
Yeah, my gosh.
Something that people will rally around.
Yeah. How do you feel that Sequoia and Kings Canyon interplay with each other, being two separate parks, but both under your leadership?
Yeah, so Sequoia National Park and General Grant National Parks were established along with Yosemite National Park in 1890. So that made those parks the second, third, and fourth national parks established after Yellowstone. And General Grant National Park was later absorbed into the much larger Kings Canyon National Park that was established in 50 years later in 1940. And until World War II, they were managed as separate parks with separate superintendents. But back in World War II, with this staffing shortages, they were combined together under one superintendent, and that has never changed back. And so today they continue to be managed together as one park. And there are some very slight differences in the legislation with one park versus the other. And for the most part, the two parks are managed as one. And this really gives us great operational efficiency. It's a big area. I mean, the two parks combined is bigger than the state of Rhode Island, but there are other large parks along those lines as well. Yosemite to the north, and Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, and several parks up in Alaska. So we can manage large land areas as a single park, but not too much difference in how we manage these two parks.
Cool. Are there any other partnerships looking forward that you're hoping to pursue with the two parks?
Yeah, so as you might imagine, managing this park, as with any park, is dependent on partnerships, agencies and non-government organization partners supporting the mission in so many different ways. And for example, one of those really important partnerships is the Sequoia Parks Conservancy that works hand in hand with our park operations. And we've talked about the Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition, which has expanded greatly, recent partners that we're working with. But looking ahead, there is a new partnership that I'm particularly excited about.
Okay.
And we're getting ready to embark to tell the story of the important role in the early stewardship of a lot of national parks like Sequoia Kings Canyon, like Yosemite, Glacier, and even Hawaii volcanoes that was played by the Buffalo Soldiers around the turn of the 20th century. Now, when Congress was established, when they established the early national parks, there was no National Park Service. So the national parks actually predate park rangers and the National Park Service that was taking care of them. And so while Sequoia Kings Canyon, for example, was established in 1890, the National Park Service was not established until 1916. And at the time, there was little financial support for parks. In fact, a congressman from Illinois, Joe Cannon, who was elected the year Yellowstone was established, later became one of the most powerful speakers of the House. And he famously proclaimed with pride, "Not 1 cent for scenery." But the parks were starting to get trashed. From grazing, from development, from poaching, from logging, and other behaviors that were going unchecked because there were not guardians on the landscape to effectively take care of them. So in the 1880s, the Secretary of the Interior cut a deal with the Secretary of the Army for the U.S. Cavalry to send troop units into Yellowstone to protect the park. And this model was expanded to Sequoia and General Grant and Yosemite and other parks as they were established. Now, among the cavalry units that patrolled these national parks in several of the parks were units that were known as the Buffalo Soldiers, and they were units of African American troops. And so for Sequoia Kings Canyon, in 1903, a company of Buffalo Soldiers under the command of Captain Charles Young, who was the third African American to graduate West Point, were dispatched from the Presidio in San Francisco to protect Sequoia and Kings Canyon. And so we consider Captain Young then, who later became a colonel and was just posthumously promoted to brigadier general by the Department of the Army. And he basically served as the first African-American superintendent of a national park.
Oh, cool.
And being West Point trained, he was trained as an engineer. And so he led the construction of roads that provided access to the giant forest and other core areas of the park. And they made so many major contributions at Sequoia, Kings Canyon, at Yosemite, and a number of other parks. And so we tell this story to some extent in many of these parks, but we want to bring that to the next level through a special film project, through exhibits, to tell the story more fully about the important role of the Buffalo Soldiers as guardians. And we know that people of color have long played important roles in our nation's history in so many different capacities. And many of the stories are interpreted within our national park system, or the stories play out in our national park system that preserves our cultural heritage. But we have not always highlighted some of those stories. And so we're trying to do a better job as a service to bring more of these stories to light and telling these diverse experiences that people from all backgrounds played in our national park system.
Yeah, I'm excited to kind of see it, that partnership comes more into fruition and the stories are brought more into the limelight from all the parks where the Buffalo Soldiers were. That's awesome.
Yeah. Excited about it.
Yeah. I know we've spent a good amount of time together, and one way I love to cap out our conversation with each superintendent asking, regardless if someone has or hasn't been to Sequoia and Kings Canyon, what is something that you wish they knew about the parks?
I would say maybe two things come to mind. One is to understand that there's so many different moving parts that makes a park run. And so when we think about the people behind it, who runs this park? Well, the answer is hundreds of people, some wearing a Park Service uniform, some from so many other different organizations and operations that are all play an important role of stewardship. We talked about the volunteerism earlier. And so it just takes a lot of different people and committed organizations to work together. And I'd say number two, we've hit on it. Being in the presence of sequoias is an incredible experience. Though you can visit trees that have stood in their spots for thousands of years, with climate change, we can no longer assume that they will always be here. So we need to take advantage of the opportunities. Don't take giant sequoias for granted. Find your opportunity
Get out to California.
Explore them. Get out to California. Many places you can go. There's some state parks. Sequoia, Kings Canyon, Yosemite National Park has them. National forests. These are incredible experiences.
The first point you hit on is my hope for the podcast and why I want to be doing this of, who runs these parks? Like it's a question as it is a statement, but, my hope is starting with the superintendents and then seeing where those conversations go, talking to all the people that make the parks, run. And for myself, I love the national parks and I love the Park Service, and it's just an honor to get to understand. And I think through understanding, you build more appreciation. But understanding everything that goes into conserving these spaces for us and for our future generations. And I'm glad you said the Sequoia Park. I'm like, everyone needs to know that these trees are 3,000 years old. I'm like, how can people not know that there are trees on this earth that are that old? So I appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit about your story and then also just your heart and vision for Sequoia and Kings Canyon.
Yeah, Maddie, it sure has been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been really great. Thanks so much, Clay. Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts or visit us at whorunsThisPark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.